it is so good to finally like be talking face to face, especially
Yes.
about your book. I mean, let's just leap right in. I'm curious for people being now introduced to the conversation about land theft. What's a
Mhm.
simplified version of that history?
When those who came over and deciding to establish racial capitalism here on this soil, they
Mm-hmm.
needed land and they needed bodies for that. Slavery became the way to bring people over to be a exploited and free labor source.
Mm-hmm.
And land was needed for those enslaved people to work on. So the demands for each begat the supply for each. More enslaved people continue to be brought over because it continues to be profitable. All of the like violence and supremacist thought and ideology was to justify the ability to continue to profit off of and like build wealth off of land theft. And that's the pre Civil War version of what land theft looks like in this country, is continuing to push indigenous people off of their land so that southern plantations can be established. And
Mm-hmm.
then when that is not quite how it's happening, it continues in westward expansion, continuing to push indigenous people off of land as far as the Pacific coast, and continuing to seek out ways to incentivize labor that could be free, whether that was sharecropping, convict leasing, homestead acts, just to establish these sorts of towns. But then once Black families begin to participate in that, it's the Tulsa Race Massacre, the Wilmington Race Massacre, the eminent domain, the USDA discrimination, the heirs property. There's all of these different strategies used to take Black land that has finally been accrued in this, like, we are able to participate in the economy route. So that's that 20th century version of land theft.
Tell me a little bit about how you approach the book with regards to depicting and helping people understand what racism actually is, as opposed to just the N word or someone
Mm-hmm.
saying something mean online, or something that's so conspicuous that we've understood as racism, but it's a little bit too narrow.
The idea that we can eradicate racism through this sort of quick 1, 2, 3 step is so underestimating what racism is. And that's why I prefer language like white supremacy, racial capitalism, because it's important to remember that this was all built so some people can get very, very rich, and they did. And that wealth was passed on to people who have inherited businesses and property and ranches and trust funds that were made possible because of the decision to steal land, whether that's railroad money, mining money, plantation agriculture money, whether it's textile money and you just got cotton for the low because you didn't have to pay the labor. Like a lot of the wealthiest families in this country, and even those who are just like squarely middle class, ease is just passed on from generation to generation. That is made possible because of the controlling of the narrative that says Black people need and depend on the structure that white people give them. And whether that's because they're lazy, whether that's because they're dumb, ultimately the all of the narratives point to, and so you are not deserving of the property. Eminent domain says we can do better for the public with this land than you could do with for you and your family and the public with this land. And it only gets used against us in this disproportionate ways.
Black Americans own less than 1% of US farmland. And there are
Mm-hmm.
folks who may have those images in their mind and say, why should we care about lands that we don't own and we'll probably never own, and upon which our greatest trauma as a people was suffered?
Whew, that is such a real point. Well, to the last thing that you said, this is land on which some of the greatest trauma our people have ever suffered, but the land did not do that. The land was not just a witness to that trauma, but actually was also a like fellow victim and hostage. And so I think that seeing the land in that way is really important, because while we are being enslaved and forced to work this land, the land is being forced to produce at unsustainable levels. The land is being transformed from swamps and marshes and lush greenery to golf courses and resorts and cities with skyscrapers. The water is poisoned, the air is toxic, the soil is weak and stripped and barren. The land is dry and catching on fire. There's a lot of ways that the land has suffered as well. These are man-made consequences that we are dealing with. And so the more that, and that's where I titled one of the chapters of the book, The Land Wants Us Back, because there's this idea that when land was in the hands of Black and Indigenous land stewards, the land was cared for, the land was loved, and we were in this sort of symbiotic, reciprocal relationship. Now the land is like crying out, and we see it and we feel it in how hot it is in early June, how hot it is in December. There's no snowfall, it's barely raining, and when it does, it's just flooding everywhere. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Like, we're seeing the impacts of what has happened. And I believe that reparations and land back for both Black and Indigenous people, which would hopefully then push a lot of people of all races into a more loving and sustainable relationship with the land, is a good thing for all of us.